Why is there suffering?
Why is there suffering? Given that I'm voluntarily watching one of your videos, Andy, I'd say suffering is self-inflicted. Let's do this.
BionicDance!
Greetings, fellow space travelers, BionicDance here. Andy is back, and this time the topic is suffering. Not so much the problem of evil, though we could get into that too, but rather suffering's cause.
You know, suffering is one of the most profound questions in some ways because it's the great leveler. Doesn't matter if you're rich or poor, what gender or race or background you come from, all of us as human beings will experience suffering at some point in our lives.
Being rich kinda helps, though. It lets you throw money at problems that would be insoluble if you're living paycheck to paycheck. I'm just saying, someone gets a nasty disease and they don't have insurance or Medicare or something, they're probably gonna suffer a lot more than someone with the dough to have a new wing built onto the hospital or can donate a new MRI machine. Those folks are looking at some preferential treatment, believe it.
And, as I record this video, this is a very personal question as well as an academic one in some ways because...
Stop. One of Andy's problems as a video maker is that he has a tendency to go down rabbit holes and climb aboard the tangent train. I am going to be skipping a great deal in his video in order to address the real point. Obviously, link in the description if you're intensely curious about what I left out.
When these kind of things happen, that question of suffering leads us to ask why. Why is the question that we tend to ask. Why suffering? Why now? Why me? Why did it happen?
Yes, we tend to ask that question when life starts to suck like the mighty Hoover. But as I'll show, not everybody is actually inquiring on the same topic when they ask it.
But you know, what's interesting is the moment we ask the question why about suffering, we need to think about which worldview, which belief system we're asking that question within. Because there's only certain worldviews that the question why makes sense in.
Again, that's only true if we're all asking the same question. The same words can mean radically different things to different people or in different contexts. And Andy only has a point if we mean what he means when we ask why we suffer.
For example, if you are an atheist, if you simply believe that everything is just atoms and particles in motion, really there is no space for asking the question why, because there is no reason. And in fact, suffering really is just nature doing its thing.
So there is a reason. What Andy isn't quite saying yet is that he thinks asking why is asking who is responsible, who did this, who can we blame? Okay, I don't like being told what I think, and I don't like to say what other people are thinking like I know their mind better than they do, but just watch the video. It's a reasonable assumption about Andy's mind. But if I, as an atheist, ask why something happened, what I'm asking is, what caused this? How did this happen? Why do I ask? So maybe I can prevent it in the future. Or maybe another person really is to blame and I need to crack a few heads. I don't know. I mean, yes, there is some of the child's cry of, "It's not fair," mixed in. And I could do a whole video on what that expression actually means because a literal interpretation doesn't usually cut it. But the point is that I'm not necessarily looking for intentional agency when life starts to stink.
Particularly if you believe that evolution is the only force operative in biology, then of course suffering is actually, evolution improving itself. Let's get rid of the weak, let's get rid of those who are not so fit, so that those who are fitter and stronger can emerge.
That's not really how natural selection works, Andy, and I'm not sure we're even using the same definition of suffering either. Suffering is not a selection pressure unto itself. It's the ability to deal with and overcome suffering, or to avoid it entirely, that'll ultimately make the difference, and even then, only if those doing the suffering haven't already procreated. Again, when I, as an atheist, ask why there is suffering, I'm really asking about the cause of the suffering. What made the suffering begin in the first place? And I'm really not sure that's what Andy is talking about at all. And before anybody accuses me of strawmanning his point, remember, Andy is talking to us about atheism and atheists right now. If anything, he's strawmanning us. And I'm just correcting him.
Then you might ask the question why in the context of Eastern worldviews. Many Eastern religions try and answer the suffering question in terms of karma.
I'm just going to skip this bit. He goes on for way too long on this topic, and frankly, I don't really care. Those who believe in karma aren't really being the obnoxious school bullies you tend to see from Christianity and Islam, just to pluck a few random examples out of the air. And since I look at my criticism of religion as activism against theists being jerks in the name of their religion, I just plain don't give a rat's. Or at least I don't until the situation at home starts to improve anyway. I can multitask, but there are limits.
So what about Christianity? Well, it's interesting that Jesus rejected both the Eastern answer and the atheist answer.
Well, of course you think that it's interesting, Andy. You're a Christian. I think it's just another in a long string of fairy stories created by humans. And since the Bible is some really badly written fantasy, honestly, it's just not that interesting.
Jesus was asked on several occasions by the crowds, about suffering. In Luke chapter 13, there's an example in the New Testament where Jesus...
Stop. We're skipping this part too. He tells a few Jesus anecdotes that seriously add nothing to the point, just examples of Jesus saying that people aren't suffering as a direct result of being bad people. That's all.
But why is there suffering? Well, if you go back to the very beginning of the Bible, and the first book of the Bible, Genesis, and the third chapter of that important book of the Bible, we read how right at the beginning of history, our first human parents who were living in this close relationship with God chose to turn their back on God, to reject God, and to go their own way.
If your children reject your way of life in favor of their own, and you decide to be a bit of a wank about it, you're the bad guy. You're a lousy parent. If your kid gets some pretty bad cancer, are you going to not help with the medical bills, not go to the hospital to give them support, not try to comfort them when the whole thing gets on top of them, just because they're not living their life your way? My parents flew across the country to be with me when I had that brain surgery to stop those damn seizures. I didn't have to ask them or worship them or obey them. They were just being loving parents. And if I thought an all-powerful and all-loving God exists, I'd think that'd be the very least he could do. And I shouldn't have to ask him to do it either. I don't think your God exists, but if he does, he's a rotten parent. If the story is true, it's not. He let his own son get killed to solve a problem he could have eliminated with a finger snap. Your God is a jerk, Andy, and I'm glad he's not real. Also, that really hurt.
And since that time, as each of us have made the same mistake and repeated it down through history, not merely has a fracture appeared in our relationship with God, but actually the Bible says it's more dramatic than that. Not merely has our relationship with God gone wrong, because of that, our relationships with each other and our relationship with the natural world, with creation, has gone wrong as well. And in fact, the whole of reality, the whole of creation is broken and damaged by what the Bible calls sin.
And your all-powerful God can't fix it, or won't fix it. In fact, it's remarkably like he isn't even there, Andy, and that's just the way the world is. The universe we see is what we'd expect to see if there is no God. So why pretend there is one? Why pretend that a couple of naked teenagers who learn about good and evil permanently broke the world in ways your God refuses to mend? I'd rather believe that Greedo shot first, or that Jar Jar Binks really is a Sith Lord trained in a drunken kung fu style and isn't just a discount Looney Tunes character. Those at least have more plausibility than Genesis ever could.
And when we ask why, we're recognizing that. We're recognizing that the world is not functioning the way that it should be.
Are we, though? When I ask why, even if I just limit it to why bad things are happening, I might be recognizing that the universe isn't how I want it to be. But what does that have to do with how it should be, Andy? Maybe the universe is exactly what it should be, and it's just not to our taste. Or maybe should be isn't even a relevant topic. Maybe the universe just is what it is, and when we ask why, there could be myriad motivations behind our inquiry. I can't even tell you how many times I've asked why something stinks for no reason other than to just know. For example, waiting sucks, but I can be a very patient person when I know the reason behind a delay. Like if a plane is late, that there was a storm they had to avoid which added time to the trip makes the wait easier to endure than if I was just told to sit down and shut up. I asked why because it helps to know. And I gave other reasons for asking why earlier, like preventing disaster in the future, or, yes, knowing who is to blame if it was caused by someone else. There can be a lot of reasons to ask why that aren't yours, Andy.
And I just wonder whether actually when we experience pain and suffering and we begin asking that why question, if for some of us that's a wake-up call that actually we need to attend to the fact that the world we live in is not just one of atoms and particles. The world we live in is the one with a God behind it, from whom we are separated.
If this is the world we'd see if we were separated from God, and it's also the world we'd see if there was no God, what reason is there to think that a God exists to give us this wake-up call? We apparently don't need a God for the universe to be what it is, and we don't see a God. And you think he's trying to talk to us through pain? What kind of sicko deity is this God of yours, Andy? If that God exists, it'd be necessary to kill him. Better to live in a pitiless and different universe, powerless to change it, than to have a cruel authoritarian deity who could fix it but refuses. What an asshole.
And the Bible then goes on not merely to diagnose what the reason for suffering is, but then in Jesus and his cross and his death and his resurrection tells the story of what God has done about suffering and to put right the problem that lies at the heart of it.
Your God is allegedly all-powerful, Andy. He wouldn't even have to wiggle his nose to make this universe a paradise beyond imagining. But he doesn't, does he? The God you're describing, Andy, would be a lot easier to believe if the Christian lore said he was flawed in some fashion. Speaking as a sci-fi and fantasy geek who argues contradictions and continuity errors with the fan community, the triple omni God and the problem of evil is a honker of an issue for the Christian narrative. Funny thing, it's terribly difficult to make a video like this and not give fuel to the chowderheads who think we're atheists because we're angry at God. But, try though I might, I cannot find a way to discuss the issue without sounding like I'm blaming God for this shitty universe. So remember, I think this reality only makes sense if the Christian God doesn't exist. It's not anger, it's not hatred, it's not even disappointment. It's an honest, scientific, thorough conclusion based on what I see in the world. So if you're the sort to marvel at my hatred of God, buzz off. You're being a jerk. Until next time, fellow space travelers, this is BionicDance saying don't run on automatic. Instead, please think. And since I look at my criticism as... even if I just limit it to bad things, why... Oy. Dewey, what the hell are you doing? Get out of the way!
Sandra, this isn't right. There has to be a better way to make money than taking these assassination contracts.
Like what? What do you have in mind?
Well, have you ever considered Patreon?
Patreon? Where people donate money for those videos I'm in? Do you really think that'll pay the bills, Dewey?
Well, if people want to prevent a few international incidents, I'm sure they'll be willing to contribute. After all, what's $1 or $2 per video to forestall the occasional war, right?
Well, I suppose I could give it a try. You'd better be right about this.
Come on, Sandra, let's go home. Sandra!
What? He was right there. I'll start that Patreon thing tomorrow. Promise. So, who wants cake? You have to rate first.